The pylon was moving, extending towards the center just as before. He had to hurry. It didn't help that the pylon's surface was so uneven, like vines twisted round a gnarled branch or muscle fibers around a diseased bone. Fortunately, it was at least 3 meters wide at the base, but still, Reeve very nearly slipped off and only caught himself at the last moment. Every fiber of his body groaned in protest as he hauled himself back up. The tip of the pylon was so narrow that he had to crawl, shimmying out as far as he dared. It was still extending towards the center of the sphere. He had no idea what would happen when the explosives interacted with the growing spatial distortion, but so long as it was suitably catastrophic, he didn't much care. It was time to admit to himself that there was no going home now. Either the collapse of the teleporter would kill him, or the mantids would. He fixed the explosives to the pylon, then started to shimmy back down. When he looked round, he saw that Yamada was still fighting furiously, cutting down one opponent after another, his arc sword just a crackling blue streak whipping back and forth. He was injured now, though. His left arm was hanging useless by his side, and Reeve could see the telltale orange smear where expansion foam had sealed a gash in his armor just below his ribs. He must have killed at least a dozen mantids, a last stand worthy of any of samurai, but more kept pouring in from the tunnels. Reeve got to his feet and started back down the pylon to go help Yamada, but before he climbed back up onto the walkway, one of the mantids managed to hook its serrated blade behind Yamada's leg. It died before it had the chance to pull the leg out from under him, but it managed to cut him badly. Down on one knee, Yamada parried a decapitating sweep from the next mantid, but couldn't dodge the thrust that came from the mantid beside it. The blade burst out the back of his armor. Even then, Yamada found the strength to raise his own sword and cut the mantid who'd impaled him in two across the thorax. Then he collapsed, falling from the walkway into the darkness below. There was nowhere for Reeve to go now. The mantids reached the pylon and started to climb down, and he had no choice but to retreat back up towards the tip. He stopped when it got narrow enough that they could only come at him one at a time. This wasn't exactly where he'd imagined he'd be standing when the explosives went off. But on the other hand, it wasn't as if being killed by the mantids would be any prettier. He just had to keep them occupied long enough to stop them from disarming the detonators. The pylon was still extending. From what Reeve had seen earlier, it was about 2 or 3 minutes until the teleporter activated. He set a timer on the explosives, 2.5 minutes. He just had to last 2.5 minutes. He was so tired his hand was shaking as he drew his arc sword from its scabbard one last time. The first mantid came at him cautiously. After watching Yamada fight, it must have developed a healthy appreciation for the human's martial skill. Reeve jabbed at it, really just trying to buy time, but ironically the mantid slipped on the uneven surface of the pylon. It threw out its arms to steady itself, leaving Reeve a clean opening to drive his sword through its neck. One down, just under 2 minutes left. The next mantid came at him more aggressively, jabbing and ducking like a boxer, and Reeve was forced back a few steps. It parried his first strike, but it tried to hook his leg like Yamada, and Reeve was ready for that. He body-checked it into the mantid behind it, and they both went tumbling off the platform. Then he made good use of the surprise and cut down the one standing behind them. Less than 1.5 minutes left. Reeve closed his eyes for a second and tried to picture Earth, specifically the stream behind his high school in Wisconsin. He'd had his first kiss there, the summer of his freshman year. He remembered how cool the stream was, and the dappled light falling through the overhanging branches, and the other girls in their bikinis on the lush green grass, before Melissa came up behind him and dunked his head under the water, and when he came up she was waiting, with a smile. If he could only save a single piece of Earth, it would be that spot. He needed that memory now, because his legs were close to giving out. He needed something to keep him going just a few seconds longer. The next mantid advanced on him and he roared and charged, all finesse gone, hacking at it so violently that after 3 blows its sword went spinning away and the 4th cut down through the top of its head all the way to its chest. On to the next one, screaming like a lunatic, overwhelming it with sheer rage. They tried to back up, but there were too many of them on the pylon and they had nowhere to go. The blood spatter on his shield grew so thick he could barely see, but he kept slashing at them until one of the mantids finally had the courage to meet force with force. It ducked under Reeve's wild swing and tackled him, throwing him down hard. Reeve tried to grapple it, pull it down with him, but their shields slid off each other, and suddenly he was laying on his back, and the mantid was standing over him with its sword raised, and he realized that he didn't have the strength left to get up again. At least he could rest now. He closed his eyes and tried to picture that summer stream. The timer beeped a warning in his ear. A second later, the universe went white. The explosion rippled through the pylon, and Reeve felt it through his back a fraction of a second before the mantid standing over him was hit by a fragment of shrapnel. It didn't penetrate the shield, but it did rip the alien away from him. Reeve was lifted up, carried by the force of the blast, and spun around so that he was able to see the pylon disintegrating beneath him. The explosives had also done their job on the pylon opposite, but more than that, it was clear that the explosion had done serious damage to whatever process the pylons had been there to mediate. The bubbling, twisting colors in the center of the sphere were expanding and contracting violently. The other pylons, the ones Reeve and Yamada hadn't been able to reach, were collapsing as well, ripped apart by the forces that had been unleashed. Reeve managed to smile in satisfaction. No one would be using this teleporter for a while. It might even take down the whole tower with it. Then he was falling. He was so tired that it took him a moment to realize what was wrong with that. He wasn't falling towards the base of the sphere. He was falling towards the center, towards the collapsing spatial distortion. Like the gravity of something entirely other than the moon had got hold of him. The bubbling, frothing lights rose and fell like an oil slick on a stormy ocean. Reeve gasped, instinctively trying to hold his breath as he plunged towards it. The distortion contracted, and for a moment Reeve thought it was collapsing in on itself. Then it ballooned outward again, exploding towards him as the chamber itself started imploding inwards. The last thing he saw was a bubble of swirling lights rushing up to meet him. Then Reeve fell into the light and was gone. Reeve stirred. He was just awake enough to know that he was still asleep, and he wanted to stay that way. Everything ached. He couldn't remember right now what he'd been doing, but he knew that he'd rather stay asleep than go back to it. All of a sudden, the memories started to rush back. He remembered being on the moon, and fighting, and being in the tower. He lay there trying to process this for a moment, wondering how much of it had been a dream. Except the pain in every single sinew of his body was far too real. He remembered finding the teleporter with Yamada and destroying it. He must have been blown clear. If this wasn't some kind of afterlife, he must be either still in the tower or out on the lunar surface, in which case he needed to move. His oxygen wouldn't last forever, and if there was still a chance of making it back to the landing craft, he wanted to get there before he was left behind to suffocate. Reeve tried to make his limbs move with limited success. However, as he tried to push himself up, he realized something. The gravity was much heavier than the moon's, which made no sense. If somehow some of his comrades had found him and brought him back to the ships, why would he still be in his armor? He opened his eyes, which didn't improve the situation much. The air was thick with smoke. But there was air, which again ruled out the vacuum of the lunar surface. He managed to force himself to his knees and realized his shield was still on. There were still little drops of blood spatter caught in it, and it was starting to pick up a lot of smoke as well. He reset it, and his view cleared a little. It looked like he was still in the teleportation chamber, except there had been no atmosphere in the mantid tower. Moreover, 2 of the pylons that he'd seen destroyed were still intact. Strangest of all, the sphere's exterior was cracked, and there were large chunks missing. Light was coming through. The teleportation chamber had been right in the center of the tower, so where could it be coming from? Reeve was on the platform that extended into the center of the chamber. He started limping towards the open door he could see ahead of him, dragging himself step by step. He must be still in the tower, so he had to get out of there. That was the only thought he could hold on to at that moment. The smoke began to clear the closer he got to the doorway. He could see something out there, indistinct shapes silhouetted in the haze. Reeve stepped through and felt the warmth of the sun on his face. He looked around. This wasn't the tower. It was some kind of flat plaza with the massive wall of the top half of the sphere rising behind him, and around the plaza a collection of low buildings. He took a few more steps. The smoke was almost gone, and he began to focus on the shapes nearest to him. Mantids. He was surrounded by mantids. Some were laying on the ground, dead or wounded. Others were trying to drag the wounded clear, or like Reeve, just limping away from the sphere. None of them were paying any attention to him. Then one of them noticed him, and it screeched in that high-pitched alien language of theirs. That was when Reeve realized they weren't wearing armor, not even spacesuits. They were dressed in a variety of shades of blue. Reeve looked up. Up in the sky, a blue sun. Then he looked out into the distance and saw the towers and the arches and the other buildings all lopsided and twisted with that strange, manted aesthetic, all bathed in the blue light of a star that from Earth was only a twinkle in the night sky. Finally, Reeve began to realize where he was. The mantids around him weren't attacking. On the contrary, they were backing away. Some had even turned to run, scuttling away on their insectal legs, and there were more high-pitched shouts. Reeve didn't need a translator to tell him that they were surprised to see him here. Nor did he need to be an expert in alien body language to read the fear in them as they scrambled to get out of his path. Then he noticed another group of mantids approaching. Only a couple of them, but these ones he recognized. Not specifically, of course, but he recognized their armor, and he recognized their swords, and he recognized the blue shimmer as they activated their shields. Reeve made sure his sword was activated, then raised it on guard. He'd been disoriented waking up on this alien world, but this was familiar ground to him. He didn't know how long he'd last. He didn't know what would happen to him. But he knew that he was going to make damn sure that the mantids here remembered the day the first humans set foot on their planet. They'd remember to stay the hell away from Earth. As the mantids rushed towards him, Reeve smiled wryly. To think a kid from Brooklyn had come all this way. And then he charged.